Hello and welcome to Broadband. Here at Broadband, we live by the philosophy that one needs other human beings to teach them how to be human. Our guide for today on this journey of communal actualization is Dr. Haneen Al Ghabra, a professor at Kuwait University's Department of Mass Communication, specializing in rhetoric and cultural studies. Dr. Al Ghabra is also the author of Muslim Women and White Femininity. She's a devoted daughter and a steadfast, intersectional feminist. I want to set the stage for this interview by shining the spotlight on three main points of focus for our dialogue. The first being Dr. Al Ghabra and her unique human journey. Next, I want to dive deep into the well of knowledge that Dr. Al Ghabra holds on the topic of feminism and the nuances that at times escapes the public's perception of the feminist movement. And finally, I want you, the listener, to be able to walk away from this conversation with a clear definition for feminism and with actionable insights for what and how you can actively participate in the fight for equal rights and opportunities for our sisters, our daughters, and our mothers. Without further ado, hello, Dr. Al Ghabra. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm much better now that I get to speak with you. So the best way to start this conversation is with a little lesson, a little bit of a history lesson on Haneen Al Ghabra. Let's start with Haneen, the daughter. You're the daughter of the celebrated scholar, analyst, and professor of political science, Dr. Shafiq Al Ghabra. How much influence did your father have on your academic and professional journey?
I think in the beginning, so I've always been in communication, more or less. So I remember like in high school, I was editor-in-chief of the high school newspaper. I always wrote poetry. I sang. I was in choir, honor choir, IMA choir, which is like when you travel to other countries to sing. So I was really, the creative side was already there, but so was the communication side. And I remember I didn't feel his influence then. I felt it when I got older. And I think that happens to everyone. When, you know, in your youth, you don't feel it till you get older. But I think when I reached the peak of my career and I worked in the private sector for like 8 years and then I went to the public sector and then I was like, okay, I'm a manager in communication. What else am I going to do? I need to go get my PhD. And that's where I felt it was the influence. That was kind of indirect also, because I was also always very active during my BA with like social justice issues. And you know, I used to go on protests. I remember after the second Intifada with Muhammad Durra and everything, we all marched to the Capitol. It was very similar to the protests now, but it didn't go viral, obviously, because social media wasn't so like nascent then and all that. But what I'm trying to say is I didn't feel it until I was going to get my PhD. And I was like, wow, he's really influenced me. I think I am an activist because of him.
And you said you started feeling it during your PhD, and you got your PhD from the University of Denver, or Denver University, I should say. Colorado means a whole lot to me as well, because I'm an alum of the University of Colorado Boulder.
Oh, I love Colorado.
It's absolutely gorgeous, isn't it? But there is Haneen, the privileged Kuwaiti woman, and Haneen, the foreign Arab student in Colorado. How important was that cultural shift to the way you saw the world?
I think what's really important is a lot of people see identity as static. They think identity doesn't move. And that's a huge problem. I see identity scholars actually speaking this way. And I think it's very problematic because your identity changes from minute to minute, from hour to hour, from day to day. My interaction with you is going to have a whole interaction of identities that will completely change if I leave and I go speak to someone delivering a product to me by DHL, let's say, downstairs. It's completely different interaction. There's different privileges and oppressions that are actually intersecting. And so being privileged, especially after I got my PhD, I felt the privilege more is I feel I'm Kuwaiti, right? But I could feel less privileged when people remind me that I'm not Asida, right? Which is also constructed, right? Like identity is constructed anyways. So it's funny, but Kuwaiti, privileged, come from a good family, I have all these privileges. And so what's really scary about this and important is I have to be aware of these privileges and how when I'm speaking to someone that has a less privileged positionality than me. So let's say I'm speaking to someone that's not Kuwaiti or I'm speaking to someone that's, you know, a domestic worker. How am I speaking to them? Am I speaking with them or for them? I think that's really important.
But identity is a huge part of the feminist movement. And I think we're going to get into it a lot deeper in this conversation. So let's start, right? So with feminism, it's an inherently Western term. It's very important that we define it so that you and I and our listeners are speaking the same language. What do you mean by feminism, and what flavor of feminism do you practice?
So I'm completely against white liberal feminism. I'll start with that. And I'll tell you why. I'll give you the history. So we always borrow from the US controls the global media. They control the history, they control textbooks, they control everything. They've also controlled the narrative of feminism. Let's be honest with ourselves. Okay. And so have the colonizers in general, right? Like if you link it to colonization, Ayam al-British with French and all that. But in general, if we learn from the US, right? We had the first movement where women wanted their right to vote. Then you had the second movement where they're like, no, we're going to learn from the Black civil rights movement. We're going to learn from them and we want our own movement, right? So this was like 60s, let's say 70s. So they have this movement. What happened is the movement was led by white women. They forgot about their sisters of color. They forgot about all the other marginalized identities. And so all these people were left out. And then the media portrayed it as if it was against men. But there were men that were already involved in the movement. And the movement does not harm men. And that's a stereotype that we need to also dismantle. And so what happened in the 90s, there was this third movement called the Intersectional Feminist movement, which is the school that I'm from, the school that I believe can help a lot in building even issues we have in Kuwait. And intersectional feminism comes from intersectionality. It was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who basically was actually, she's in the field of law. So has nothing to do with communication or with anything. But she basically saw that people were getting, defendants and prosecutors were getting, they were prosecuting people based on the color of their skin. If you're Black, oh, you're already gonna get arrested, literally. And so Kimberly Crenshaw termed it the coin intersectionality, which means that our identities, the intersection of our identities, whether it's race or class or sexuality or education, is really different from woman to woman. And so intersectional feminism looks at these intersections. So I can't just look at myself as a woman. So you're a man and I'm a woman. That doesn't work. I'm a Kuwaiti privileged woman who has a PhD, but who's also originally Palestinian, who's also, and I don't know. And you have your own intersections as well, right? And so the intersection is what can form our lived experience. So our lived experiences through our identities is what really helps us know what our needs are. So a Badoon woman in Kuwait is not going to have the same needs as a Kuwaiti woman. And that's the problem with the feminist movement in Kuwait, is that we picked up, and I'll take the blame for it too. Everybody has picked up this liberal feminist. And I was, by the way, in 2000, maybe 4 or 5, I was that liberal feminist. But then I learned intersectional feminism and I learned what intersectionality was. So it's not like you can't change, right? But that's the only thing I was exposed to, and all the other women here in Kuwait. And there are a group of intersectional feminists, an amazing group, small, very small group, but they're making strides and we're all working together. But the problem with the movement here is it's very privileged. We're talking about harassment when we have deeper issues. Doesn't mean harassment's not important. It's important, but we have deeper issues. Is that, you know what I mean?
100%. And it seems like there needs to be some kind of alignment for the movement to actually progress and to expand and hopefully get something done. Do you see that there is some kind of bridge that's being formed by the traditionally white liberal movement of feminism and the new small group that is intersectional feminism?
I see people switching slowly. I see people, they're worried that they're going to be called out for being privileged. But I also feel like you can't have allyship unless you disrupt your privilege by yourself or have people disrupt it for you.
It's a very intimate disruption, right? You have to be the one to do it. It's your own paradigm that you have to shake up.
Well, so when I was in college, when I was during my PhD, I had to take a whole class on that, on disrupting my privilege. And I had the trainer, the professor and the trainers with her were disrupting our privilege. And it was very uncomfortable. I would go home crying. But the whole point is for you to reflect on your privilege. I have my students write about it. And if they don't reflect on their privilege, I tell them, I'm going to make you rewrite the assignment. Because it's so much easier to say you're oppressed. And this is what's problematic. I can say I'm oppressed. And I will say I'm oppressed as a woman, and I will, but it's so much harder for me to say that I'm privileged. Nobody wants to say they're privileged because you're actually admitting that you're part of a system that oppresses, no matter how progressive you are.
Right. It's easy to play the victim, and it's very difficult to be introspective and to reflect on your own, I guess, oppressive nature, right? If you think that you're privileged and you're not even taking into account the domestic workers' rights, then are you truly a virtuous protester, right?
Exactly. I see that all the time.
Something that you brushed up on is the effect of colonialism on the spreading of feminism in the Arab world, in the Gulf states. A person who is historically viewed as the first Arab feminist was Qasim Amin, one of the founders of the Egyptian national movement and Cairo University. He was quoted as saying, "If Egyptians did not modernize along European lines, and if they were unable to compete successfully in the struggle for survival, they would be eliminated." So how was Qasim Amin's philosophy of adopting European values, including feminism, received in Egypt at the time?
So Qasim Amin, the thing with Qasim Amin is he was your typical colonial feminist. He was this man that was speaking for women. He basically, so if you read like Layla Ahmed's work, who I'm actually in love with, I love her work. I love every single book she's read. I think she's a genius. She basically says that, you know, the colonizers came in. First, education was free in Egypt. Colonization happened. You know, they started actually capitalizing it. So it became like this capitalistic industry. Now some people can't afford it. And then basically they started telling the elite, right? Because they're not going to give the country to the poor. They said, we're going to leave, okay? You know, and I'm saying it like a story just to make it simple. But there was this unspoken, like, please take off your hijab, right? Take off your hijab. We need to modernize you, right? And that comes with colonization and modernization and capitalism and liberalization. So like, we need to modernize you. So there was this whole unspoken thing. It wasn't like everybody took off their hijab. No, but it happened a lot in the upper class. So what happened was this backlash from the lower classes, and the middle was kind of like stuck in between. So you have these women, elite, you know, taking off the hijab, but you also have this like hiqd, you know, like revenge against the West for colonizing us. So you have this also the more like conservative, like I'm going to keep the hijab on, right? So Qasim Amin was one of those, you know, elite, like colonial feminists. Him and there was another feminist, completely slipped my mind, but it's okay, it'll come to me. And they were championed for feminism, but it was really not helping anyone but the elite. And so Layla Ahmed critiques that, and it's a beautiful critique. I speak about it in my book, also write about it in my book. But so I think it's important because the question you're asking is an excellent question, because this set the stage for feminism in the region, because we started borrowing from this colonial feminism, which is also white feminism.
Right. But it does at the same time, from what Qasim Amin mentioned about Egyptians adopting European values or being eliminated, it seems that one of the negative effects of colonialism is the belief that your own culture is backward and inferior. So how much of Arab feminists advocating for feminism truly to liberate women rather than to kind of be aligned with European values?
A lot. And I think Qasim Amin is a good example of this, because when he wrote The Liberation of Women, Tahrir al-Mar'a, it was celebrated as feminism, but he was reflecting the internalization of the colonized. So what's really important here is there's a really thin line between internalizing this colonial narrative, this colonial feminism, but also trying to fight for your own rights within your country. But as a feminist, it's an issue, because how do I fight whiteness and colonization and them putting their hands and meddling in our business, right? When we have our own feminists that can do that job. But also, how do I tackle my own issues without outside help? There's a thin line. Sometimes you need to cross the line, sometimes you don't. And you feel guilty when you cross the line. I think that's another thing. Not for the colonial feminists. They'll cross the line all the time. I'm talking about our feminists. We feel guilty because we're like, oh my God, how did I speak to the UN? How did I speak to the EU? No, sometimes we need to do that, but we feel guilty when we do it, because we feel like, are we internalizing this narrative? Are we this? I mean, it just happened to me actually a couple of weeks ago where I just had a phone call and I felt guilty.
So did you feel guilty because you felt like this movement in your country, in the Arab world, should be under your control and your control alone? It should be like an intimate relationship between you and this movement?
I think it's because we know what our issues are. And the problem is when we allow the West to intervene, they hijack our issues instead of helping us. So they speak for us instead of speaking with us. Sometimes you feel so much oppression. And I think this is really important. We feel so much oppression as women that we have this urge to be like, you know what, come in, save us, because our men don't really care about giving us our rights. So there's also that, you know?
Yeah. So we talked about Layla Ahmed, and Layla Ahmed writes about the veil, about the hijab, about the niqab, about these objects that seem to carry a lot of social and political meaning. And for those of you who don't know Layla Ahmed, she is a Harvard divinity professor. She's the author of Women and Gender in Islam. And she argued that the return of the veil in both Western and Arab societies is a clear sign of the reaction or the reactions to 9/11 attacks. What does she mean by that, Dr. Haneen?
So Layla Ahmed traces the veil from, I don't know what year. Well, actually, even from colonization until till she published the book, which I don't remember when it was published, but I think it was 2004 or 8. But anyways, so she traces the veil. She says in the oil boom years, when we discovered oil, there was this whole like thankfulness. So you had these women putting the hijab on. She speaks, she gives you 8, 9 different interpretations. It's so beautiful. And then she speaks about after September 11th, there was a number of women that were taking it off because they were scared, because they were getting discriminated against and they were getting bullied in the US, especially for being Muslim and wearing a hijab. But then you had another bunch that were angry that they were being discriminated against, so they wore the hijab. And so she gives you all these different interpretations, and they're very deep interpretations. I'm giving you just surface points right now.
Yeah, and I would encourage all our listeners to read Women and Gender in Islam. She talks about how the veil or the hijab is used as a object of protest and liberation. And
so the veil one was Quiet Revolution. She does the one where she gives you 8, 9 interpretations. Women, Gender in Islam, by the way, I'm so happy you brought that up, because it's really important to look at feminism from an Islamic framework. And that's what she does so beautifully. And because I feel like a lot of Islamic feminists are discriminated against and they're not welcomed into the feminist community. And that's not okay. Actually, even hatta like al-banat al-qaba'il, right? The tribal feminists, like,
from the tribes.
They also get excluded. And I think that's really important because they have to work within their spheres. And I think that's important because there are an amazing Islamic feminists, amazing feminists that are working within their Bedouin communities to dismantle all these oppressions that they're facing.
Okay, and so let's talk about oppression, because historically, Iran and Turkey and currently France have all regulated and, in my opinion, oppressed the way women dress by banning the hijab. And now Iran, I think, also oppresses and regulates women's lives by enforcing the hijab or the veil. So what effect do these bans have on women's psyche and their attitude with agency?
I think this is a really important question as well, because it's kind of like we're stuck in this double patriarchy. France is telling you to take off the hijab, but also Iran is telling you to cover, as an example, and other countries. And so women have no agency. Your agency is completely stripped of you because you have to basically either take it off or put it on, depending on the country. First of all, we should have the right to choose whether to cover or not to cover. And so again, that's the whole like Western narrative versus Eastern narrative, right? So you have these men, patriarchal Arab men or Muslim men telling you to cover. And then you have this Western men telling you to uncover. Did they ever ask us what we want? And so I think this is the most important question, because you have no agency at that point.
Hey guys, this is the part of the podcast where people usually tell you to buy this product or subscribe to this service, but we don't have any sponsors yet. So we'll sell ourselves instead. We have 4 simple asks. 1, please subscribe if you haven't already. 2, share the podcast. Share it with your friends, share it with your family, and share it with a stranger. Start a conversation. 3, check out the show notes. You can find all the references that we've already made and are about to make on there. And 4, engage with us on Instagram and email. Enjoy the rest of the show. And these are some fundamental issues in a gigantic institution that we need to address, but it also kind of seems like a societal issue. How can we shake up the society to completely abandon these, in my opinion, backwards mentalities and norms?
Well, I think it starts with awareness. The problem is like we keep raising awareness, but then nothing gets done. And, like we raise awareness, we speak to some MP, and then nothing gets done. We need action, right? So it's the same thing with women and abuse, right? There's all these abuse cases happening. There was a Bedouin woman that was being abused. She can't leave her house because she doesn't have a job. She can't get married. She lives in this tiny house. The living conditions are bad, right? The conditions aren't going to make it easier on the men either, right? And so it's spilling over onto her as a woman. And so these are when I'm talking about intersections, but there's a bunch of things. Abuse is normalized in our society.
So can you expand on what you mean by abuse is normalized in our society?
So we're taught to be silent, not to go to the maghfar, because if you go to the police station, it's going to look bad, right? You're going to the police station, you're basically saying that your husband hit you, and that's an issue, right? And then you have to go to the doctor, and then that's it. Society knows. And so we're conditioned, especially in collective societies, all collective societies, even if you go to like Latino societies, there's this huge normalization of abuse, like even within the family, even sexual abuse. It's normalized. It's okay for the uncle will abuse a little boy. Okay. We're not talking about only girls. I'm talking girls and boys, right? And then they're taught to not talk about it.
Yeah, but okay, so there are all these people that are marginalized. You're talking about maybe little boys, little girls. You're talking about Bedouin women. You're talking about wives, right? In a lot of relationships in Kuwait, and they can't speak for themselves. So what's the best way to support the, at times, voiceless women, domestic workers, whatever, right? Who's struggling, and their struggles are often ignored by the mainstream feminist movement. So what's the best way to support them without speaking on their behalf and completely taking over the message?
Well, see, that's the dilemma too, because if you integrate them into the movement, they might get hurt. So let's say, like, okay, let's bring some domestic workers into the movement, right? It would have to be underground, kind of, because you don't want them to get deported. Same thing with the Bedouin issue. You don't want to call them out, so you have to ask them what they need instead of speaking for them. So the first thing is to ask them what they need, is to actually sit with them and see what their needs are, and then ask how you can help. And I think what we're doing is the opposite. We think we can speak for them, but we have to be into the community. So I'll give you another example of this whole like intersecting oppression. So Bedouin woman, she marries a Kuwaiti and she has 4 kids. He beats her up to the point where she gets a concussion. She's hospitalized. She goes back to him. Why does she go back to him? Where else is she going to go? She's already living in the most oppressive conditions you could ever think. And that's the politics of death, which was a term also developed by Michelle Mabembe, Akile Mabembe, which is necropolitics, right? The politics of death. You're living like you're dead, right? And I think this is the situation with the Bedouin and with what's happening with the Palestinians, is you're subjugated to live like you're dead. So the only way to free yourself is to escape death, is to literally die, right? So you have suicides, you have suicide bombers, you have blah, blah, blah.
I see. Wow. Mind blown. All right. So, I mean, a lot of listeners may not know what Bedouin means because we have listeners that aren't from Kuwait, but Bedouin literally translates to without. And there's a group of people that are stateless or without passport or without citizenship. And they've been a part of our society here in Kuwait for decades. And they've been very active in contributing to our society. At the same time, they don't have Kuwaiti citizenship. And so, all right, so this is one thing. Now let's talk about allyship, right? So if everyone is too concerned about what they have the right to talk about, are the important issues ever going to be discussed? How can we ensure that we communicate with the marginalized people to get their needs and act on them immediately?
Well, it's much more complicated than that. So like, for example, we need to ally even within our community. So let's imagine like a circle of Kuwaiti women. Within that circle, there will already be dynamics of privilege and oppression. And so how am I aware of what I'm saying to this person who I think is less Kuwaiti than me, right? And so you can feel that happening. You could have a Kuwaiti that's originally, supposedly Kuwaiti that's, tribal, Kuwaiti Palestinian. When you put these women all together, those dynamics are already at play. So if we can't within us ally, which we need to, right? Then how are we going to ally with other intersecting identities? And so I think that's the most important thing when we're speaking of allyship, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, okay. So not much has changed for the feminist movement in 100 years, if you really look at it. So what's your dream for the movement for the next 100 years to actually get some actionable items ticked off the list?
So I feel like the citizenship one is really big, especially for kids, because I'm seeing families being torn apart from this issue, right? And I feel like it will help a little bit with the Bedouin issue for the Bedouin kids that have Kuwaiti mothers. So it's like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. I would then tackle abuse in all forms, right? We need laws to protect our health. And I think that's an issue. We need a quota in the parliament if you want to talk about politics, right? So you have health, you have politics. We need a quota in the parliament. Legally, we need to get rid of Article 182 and 153, right? Citizenship. We need citizenship for our kids, right? For our spouses, but especially our kids.
Okay, and so honestly, it sounds like there needs to be a lot of work on a institutional level. There needs to be a lot of work on a societal level. So how can men and women alike, feminists, listening to this episode, support the women fighting for equal rights and make sure that they feel safe in their own skin and also feel safe in their environment?
It's being an ally and, standing with women, right? Whenever they want to protest, whenever they want to speak, whenever they have an issue, it's speaking about these issues, but it's also asking them, what do they need? And so whether it's passing citizenship, whether it's abuse and the lack of stuff we have for abuse here, our shelters and everything, whether it's legal rights, whether it's a Badoon issue, whether it's all these, there's other marginalized communities also, which I'd love to talk about, which I can't right now, but how do we stand together and help not just women, even other marginalized identities?
Yeah, like domestic workers, etc. The point of having this conversation is to spread, I guess, not only just a message, but to spread takeaways and action items and ways to get people to, change incrementally. So what's an important message that you want our audience to take away from our discussion?
I would say that I hope if you have privilege that you'll find the space to reflect, and that if you have oppression, that you'll find the space to heal.
Powerful words by the powerful Dr. Haneen. I love that. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so the people who are familiar with you and your body of work are very comfortable in calling you a world-class performer in your field, and something that I do very often with you. So I'm sure that didn't come by accident. What's a habit that you're grateful for developing in your journey, one that you may attribute to your success?
I think looking at charts of privilege and oppression and mapping out your privileges, so I think that's a good takeaway. It's not a habit that I have, but it's something it's innate now in me. But what are your privileges in terms of education, nationality, accent, language, religion? What are your privileges? But what are your oppressions, right? You can even list them down and they will change geographically.
Okay, which book, fiction or nonfiction, inspired you to a call to action on a personal or career level?
I would say there are books that inspire me now, but didn't inspire me to call to action. But I would say one of my favorite books, Bell Hooks, All About Love, and Bell Hooks, Something Feminism. I love those books. But what inspired me was not a book. What inspired me to go into intersectional feminism was my advisor, Bernadette Khalifa. She is also a walking book. So her work is amazing. And I think she changed my life. She completely changed my life. She taught me what it meant to be critical. And I think critical, of course, doesn't mean being negative, right? But being critical of power structures, being critical of rhetoric. She taught me how to bring in the performativity, right? So I do a lot of performance work in some of my research where I write poetry onto the paper, where I can get my creative side out. And she taught me so much. She taught me how to teach with love, which I think is the most important thing. Because when you teach with love, which Bell Hooks always also says, right, is when you teach your students with love, they actually respond. It's like a magic wand. They'll respond. It doesn't mean you're going to say, I love you. No, I'm saying you are nurturing them in a way that you're giving them love by showing them that you care about teaching them. I care and I want to teach you. And they automatically respond. It's ridiculous how responsive they can be. I think this is the most powerful thing she taught me, besides, of course, teaching me how to write like a pro. And so I could go on forever. And that's what inspired me. It wasn't really a book. Then it became there are books that I love, like the ones I mentioned, right?
All right, fantastic. You honestly gave us a lot of fuel in multiple ways. Fuel to want to participate and be active members of the feminist community, and fuel to be more inclusive of people. It doesn't necessarily only have to be women. We have Badoon, we have domestic workers, we have children, we have people with disabilities. So I truly thank you from the bottom of my heart for expanding my paradigm and for doing it for our listeners. I truly appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining our discussion and our dialogue. And I'm grateful for you. So thank you.
I'm grateful for the questions. The questions were great.
Listen, I wanted to show you that I appreciated you by writing good questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. This podcast would not be possible without your support. So please subscribe to our podcast, share it with your friends and family, check out the show notes for any references made, and engage with us on Instagram and email. Thank you.